Hello folks. Let's dive into a fascinating chapter of history that might feel a world away if you're not familiar with the Soviet Union. Today, I'm going to talk about the Soviet economy under communism, specifically, how even the top leaders knew it was broken, and the messy, often futile attempts to fix it. We'll walk through this like a story, from the 1950s right up to the collapse in the late 80s. I'll explain the key concepts as we go, especially the ones rooted in Soviet realities, that might not click right away for someone raised in a market-driven society like the US. Think of this as a what went wrong tale, full of good intentions, bad incentives, and a system that just couldn't adapt. Let's start with the big picture. The Soviet Union ran on what's called a centrally planned economy. That means the government, through a massive bureaucracy, decided everything: what factories produced, how much, at what prices, and where it all went. No free market, no supply and demand setting the rules. It was all top-down directives from Moscow. By the 1950s, after World War II and the death of Joseph Stalin, many in the Soviet elite realized this setup wasn't working well. Production was inefficient, quality was often terrible, and everyday people faced constant shortages of basic goods. But reforming it? That was like trying to tweak a massive, rigid machine without breaking it entirely, because admitting the whole system was flawed could undermine the communist ideology that justified the regime. The first big push came under Nikita Khrushchev, who took over after Stalin in 1953. Now, Khrushchev gets a bad rap in jokes as this bumbling guy obsessed with corn. People even quipped about planting it on Mars. But he wasn't dumb, he was pragmatic. During a visit to the US, he saw how American farms used corn as cheap, efficient animal feed. Soviets wanted more meat, eggs, and dairy in their diets, things that required feeding livestock. Corn grows fast, can be harvested mechanically on a huge scale, and it's perfect for that. So, Khrushchev issued a directive: plant more corn everywhere to boost food production. Sounds sensible, right? But here's where the Soviet system kicked in. The economy wasn't about real results, it was about generating reports that said you followed orders and exceeded targets. Local officials, desperate to look good, started planting corn in ridiculous places, like the freezing Kamchatka Peninsula in the Far East, where it couldn't possibly thrive. They did this at the expense of crops better suited to those regions, like wheat or potatoes. The result? A total mess. Corn yields tanked in unsuitable areas, overall grain production suffered, and by the 1960s, the USSR had to start importing massive amounts of grain from abroad, mostly feed corn, ironically. This was the beginning of the Soviet Union becoming a net food importer, despite its vast farmland. It highlighted a core problem: central planning ignored local conditions and rewarded blind obedience over smart adaptation. Next up was Leonid Brezhnev, who became leader in 1964. He was sharp in his early years and pushed for reforms to motivate workers. The idea was simple: tie pay to performance. Work hard, get rewarded; slack off, get less. This led to something called Khazraschet, which roughly translates to economic accountability, or self-financing. For the first time, factories and farms could calculate a profit, the difference between revenues and costs, and keep some of it. This was revolutionary in a socialist system, where profit was seen as a capitalist evil. The government even ran propaganda campaigns explaining why socialist profit was good: it motivated efficiency for the people, while capitalist profit was bad, it exploited workers for the rich. This is where we see the seeds of market-like thinking creeping in. But problems popped up immediately. First, what to do with that profit? You couldn't just give it all out as bonuses because there was a strict wage fund, a fixed pot of money allocated for salaries across the whole economy. Why the limit? The Soviet money supply was getting out of whack. They printed more rubles to pay people, but prices were fixed by the state, so goods disappeared from shelves, creating chronic shortages, or deficits, in Soviet lingo. People turned to black markets, where speculators resold stuff at inflated prices. Dumping profit into wages would flood the system with even more money, chasing too few goods, leading to hyperinflation or worse chaos. Second, prices for everything a factory produced were set by Gosplan, the State Planning Committee, a huge agency that tried to micromanage the entire economy. They calculated prices as costs plus a planned profit margin. So, if a manager cut costs to boost efficiency, their total revenue, called gross output or eval, would drop, because lower costs meant lower prices. And missing your gross output target? That got you in serious trouble, demotions, firings, or worse. Managers also had to hit physical targets, produce X pairs of shoes in specific styles. Failing either metric meant big penalties. Scrapping gross output or fixed prices. That would dismantle the whole planned economy, which was sacred. It risked people asking, what was the revolution for if we're just becoming capitalists? There were whispers of bolder reforms under Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin in the late 60s, but he died in 1980, and the hardline ideologues, clinging to Marxism-Leninism, probably wouldn't have allowed it anyway. So, they kept tinkering with Khazras-Chet, but the economy grew more complex. You couldn't just bark orders from the center anymore. Shooting dissenters like in Stalin's purges wasn't an option post-1950s, so they leaned on incentives, but too much local freedom meant losing control. Factories might hike prices, pocket profits as wages, or even steal resources for the growing shadow economy, underground businesses, not just petty black market dealing. From the ground level, it was absurd. Take a factory director trying to make better suits, good patterns from a designer? No budget line for that, violate it, and you're in jail. Quality fabric? Only allocated centrally through funds, not buyable on the open. Approvals for new designs or prices? Endless bureaucracy. Workers had their own headaches. If an innovator boosted productivity and overperformed, they'd earn a fortune under piece rates, but the wage fund cap meant rates got slashed for everyone. Brigades would beat up the rate buster to protect their pay. This sparked real unrest. In 1962, workers in Novocherkassk rioted over price hikes and wage cuts, and troops shot dozens dead. It was hushed up, but it showed the system's fragility. Ditch the wage fund? Sure, but then you'd unbalance money and goods even more. Pay construction workers big now, they spend it in stores, but the factory output might arrive next year. Shortages were already epic, leading to sneaky price hikes, like shrinking a 1 kilogram bread loaf to 800 grams while keeping the price at 16 kopecks. They plugged holes with oil exports for dollars, buying imports. Soon, Soviet-made stuff was seen as junk for the masses, while elites chased foreign goods from black markets or second-hand shops. Enter Yuri Andropov in 1982, a former KGB chief. He focused on discipline, cracked down on theft, speculation, and absenteeism. Solid idea, the economy was riddled with corruption. But execution? They executed a major Moscow store director for graft. Good riddance to crooks, but suddenly, that store's shelves went bare, no more queuing for rare items, it was like a rural co-op. Strengthening meant KGB raids on baths, cinemas, and barbershops to catch workday truants. They nabbed legit folks, like professors who only had to be on campus for classes. Rumor has it Andropov got sick from the backlash. Then Konstantin Chernenko in 1983, with his slogan, "The economy must be economical." Spot on, since Soviet resource use was wildly inefficient, wasting energy, fuel, and labor, compared to the West. But again, planning blocked fixes. A director might optimize fabric cutting with a research institute, but saving material meant missing scrap quotas for recycling, leading to punishment. True stories. One boss got reamed for less metal waste after efficiency gains. Engineers optimizing cloth patterns got rejected by legit factories, but hired by illegal underground ones, everyone ended up in prison. Save fuel? Limits cut. Fire deadweight? Lose your wage fund. Incentives punished thrift. Finally, Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985 introduced Gospodpriemka, state quality control, mimicking military inspections. Soviet consumer goods were awful, but weapons were top-notch. Why not make TVs like missiles? TV propaganda asked. But missiles cost a fortune, applying that rigor to toasters would bankrupt everything. And since inspectors were paid from factory funds, they prioritized quotas over quality. In the end, these reforms fizzled because the plan was law, unchangeable without ditching socialism. Gosplan couldn't intelligently plan millions of products by the 80s, it was impossible. Cancel planning earlier, under Khrushchev? Maybe the USSR becomes like China's market socialism or even the US. But they waited until collapse, propping it up with oil money. Pull one string, another tangled, fix that, something else broke. When oil prices crashed in the 80s, the whole thing imploded. So, what can we learn? Systems resist change when ideology trumps reality. The Soviets had smart ideas but a structure that turned them toxic. Thanks for listening. Any questions?